What if I told you the woman who sent Anne Boleyn to her death walked to the very same block 6 years later? But she wasn't there because she betrayed her sister-in-law. She was there because she had built a pattern of destroying queens. History calls Jane Boleyn a survivor. But why did she volunteer testimony against Anne Boleyn when she could have stayed silent and still safe? What if she was planning the deaths of not one, but 2 queens? Queens who were her own family. But how did a smart woman like her make the fatal mistake that cost her everything? What if she wasn't the cleverest woman in the room, but the perfect pawn? And what secret did Jane discover about Henry VIII that made him rewrite English law just to execute one woman? By the end of this story, you'll understand how a brilliant woman's survival strategy became her death sentence, and why her execution changed English law forever.
If this tragedy already pulls you in, give this video a like. It helps his story reach more eyes.
The year is 1540. Jane Boleyn stands in Catherine Howard's chambers watching a 19-year-old girl cry over love letters. "Lady Rochford," Catherine whispers, "what should I do?" Jane smiles. She's been waiting for this question her entire life. But her story doesn't start here. It starts 20 years earlier. Jane will give Catherine advice that destroys them both. But first, you need to understand how Jane learned to hate. 1522. 15-year-old Jane Boleyn, née Parker, enters Henry's court like a merchant's daughter at a cattle market. She is not beautiful like the Boleyn sisters dancing beside her. She's not royal like Princess Mary watching from the throne. Jane is something more dangerous. She's smart and invisible. Her father, Henry Parker, 10th Baron Morley, was a gentleman usher to Henry VIII. He taught her Latin and French. Her mother, Alice St. John, taught her to curtsy when powerful men make decisions about her life. But Jane teaches herself the most valuable skill at court: how to watch, how to listen, how to remember. The great hall glitters with cloth of gold and ambition. Musicians play while nobles dance. Everyone smiles. Everyone lies. Jane sees Anne Boleyn catch the king's eye across the room, sees Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, pretend not to notice, sees the exact moment when everything changes. Power shifts like a fever. One day you're healthy. The next, you're dying. Jane decides she'll never be the patient. In 1525, Jane marries George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. He was an English courtier and nobleman. On paper, the wedding is perfect. George is handsome, educated, and wealthy. He's Anne's brother, which means he's connected to the future queen. Jane gets a title, security, and access to power. What she doesn't get is a husband who comes home. George writes poetry about the torments of marriage. He writes verses that mock marriage, mocking the bonds that tie men to their wives. At court, his words spread like gossip, clever lines that make others laugh but leave Jane humiliated. Men whispering about him long after the candles burn low. Other wives cry about unfaithful husbands. Jane doesn't cry. She collects evidence. Because Jane has learned something the weeping wives haven't. Tears don't change men, but secrets do. She starts small. A letter left on George's desk. A conversation overheard in the garden. Names, places, times. George doesn't love her? Fine, but he will fear her. Jane watches other marriages at court. She sees how Mary Boleyn laughs when Henry gives her jewels, how Anne blushes when the king writes her love letters, how other noble wives receive flowers, gifts, attention. Jane's husband gives her nothing except his name and his debts. A Portuguese diplomat will later write about Jane's envy and jealousy. But he misses the point. This isn't about love. This is about survival. In 1533, Anne Boleyn became Queen of England. Henry had broken his kingdom in half to marry her, tearing England from Rome, defying the Pope, risking rebellion. For a while, it looked like love had conquered everything. Henry showered Anne with gifts, palaces, jewels, silks brighter than anything the court had ever seen. He wrote her letters filled with passion. He couldn't wait to touch her hand, to lean close, to be alone. Jane watched all of it. She saw Henry bend to Anne's laughter, saw him rage when she denied him, saw him return again and again like a moth to a flame. And Jane knew she would never have that. Not with George. Her husband mocked marriage in verse, spent his nights with poets and musicians, and left her with whispers instead of love. Now Jane became Anne's lady-in-waiting. It may sound like an honor. In truth, she held Anne's mirror while the Queen saw her reflection. She arranged Anne's jewels while Anne argued with Henry through the door. She pretended to sleep while Anne paced at midnight, talking to herself. "He blames me for everything," Anne whispered one night. "The lack of sons, the rebellion in Ireland, everything." Jane nodded sympathetically. Inside, she was taking notes. She also saw something else. George's loyalty to Anne. When Anne looked weak, George stood beside her. They shared jokes no one else understood. They spoke French when they wanted privacy. When the king's temper grew dangerous, George stepped closer, shielding his sister with his presence. He defended her in council, gave her the kind of advice that could survive a kingdom's hatred. And Jane felt it like a wound. Her husband's heart and loyalty belonged to his sister, not to her wife. He would risk everything for Anne. For Jane, he offered nothing at all. The Portuguese diplomat was right about Jane's jealousy, but he was wrong about the target. Jane isn't jealous of George's affairs. She's jealous of his loyalty. George would die for Anne. He barely remembers that Jane exists. 1534. Jane makes her first mistake. She tries to help Anne get rid of one of Henry's mistresses. The plan backfires spectacularly. Henry banishes Jane from court. Not Anne, not George, just Jane. Her own family watches her leave. Her husband doesn't fight for her. Her sister-in-law doesn't protect her. Jane spends 8 months in exile, watching from her father's estate as ravens bring news from court. Henry's not visiting Anne as often. He's looking at Jane Seymour. The Boleyn star is falling. During those long winter nights, Jane makes a decision that will kill 3 people. If her family won't protect her, she'll protect herself. When Jane returns to court in April 1536, she returns to court like a knife returning to its sheath. But first, she needs practice destroying a queen.
Anne is desperate enough to welcome her back. The Queen needs allies. Henry's courtiers are already bowing to Jane Seymour. The music has stopped, but Anne is still dancing. "Sister," Anne says, taking Jane's hands, "I've missed your counsel." Jane smiles. "I've missed serving you, Your Majesty." But she was lying. She knows it. Jane will soon tell Thomas Cromwell something that seals 3 death warrants. But here's the twist. She doesn't confess under torture. She volunteers.
May 1st, 1536. Anne and Jane walk in the Queen's private garden. Spring flowers sway in the breeze. Only days earlier, Anne had discovered Henry's latest betrayal, a jeweled locket. One she had once worn proudly, now hung around Jane Seymour's neck. The king had stopped coming to her bed, claiming illness or business, yet he found endless time to whisper to Jane. Anne lowers her voice. "We can't—" She pauses, checks the walls, then switches into French. "I have failed as a woman, again and again, and he blames me." Jane nods gently, her face full of sympathy. Anne paces. "I've prayed, I've called physicians, I've tried every remedy I know. But without a son, what becomes of Elizabeth? What becomes of me?" They both know the answer. Queens without sons don't last. Anne presses on, her words rushing out. She speaks of Henry's anger. She speaks of Henry's weakness. She speaks of George's loyalty. She speaks of fear, of shame, of what the future might hold. And then she says something more, something small, almost buried in the flow of her despair. Jane's eyes flicker. She keeps her face calm, but inside she marks it down. That one phrase will seal Anne's fate, because discussing the king's sexual failures is treason. Questioning his ability to produce heirs is treason. Talking about the royal succession with anyone except the king is treason. Anne has just confessed to 3 capital crimes, and Jane is the only witness. 1536. Thomas Cromwell's men arrive at the Boleyn house with smiles and warrants. They don't arrest Jane. They invite her to answer questions. The interrogation room smells of fear. Cromwell sits behind a polished table covered with documents. His clerks hold quills like surgeons hold scalpels. "Lady Rochford," Cromwell begins, "you've served the Queen faithfully." "Yes, my lord." "You've observed her private moments, her conversations with her brother." Jane's heart pounds, but her voice stays steady. "Yes, my lord." "Did she ever discuss the king's personal matters?" Here's the moment. Jane can lie and join her family in the Tower, or tell the truth and watch them burn alone. Jane chooses the truth, not from honesty, from the calculation. She tells Cromwell about Anne's complaints, about her discussions with George, about her fears for Elizabeth's future. Every word is accurate. Every word is deadly. May 15th, 1536. George Boleyn faces his judges in the Tower's Great Hall. The charges are adultery and incest with his sister. The evidence comes from his wife's testimony. Jane sits in the gallery watching her husband realize she's destroyed him. George argues brilliantly. He dismantles the prosecution's timeline. He questions their witnesses. He points out the impossibility of the charges. But he can't argue with Jane's words. The jury hears that George discussed Henry's impotence with Anne, that they shared private jokes about the king's failures, that they questioned Elizabeth's safety if Henry died without sons. To the judges, this intimacy proves guilt. If George and Anne share Henry's bedroom secrets, what else do they share? George looks up at Jane once during the trial. His eyes ask a simple question: why? Jane doesn't answer. She doesn't need to. May 17th, 1536. George Boleyn dies on Tower Hill. May 19th, 1536. Anne Boleyn follows. Jane watches both executions from her window. 2 heads fall. 1 woman rises. Jane will spend the next 5 years serving 4 more queens, but she'll never stop hunting.
May 20th, 1536. Jane wakes up a widow with blood on her hands and gold in her accounts. George's death makes her wealthy. His estates pass to her control. His debts disappear with his life. Most widows would retreat to the countryside and pray for forgiveness. Jane does the opposite. She fights her way back to court. It takes skill. Thomas Cromwell helps, probably because she proved useful during the trials. Henry's new wife, Jane Seymour, needs experienced ladies-in-waiting who understand royal protocol. More importantly, they need women who know how to keep deadly secrets. Jane reinvents herself as the perfect servant, silent, capable, invisible. She serves Jane Seymour until the Queen dies in childbirth. Then Anne of Cleves, until that marriage collapses. Each queen trusts her because Jane survived the others. Each queen dies or disappears. Only Jane remains. By 1540, Jane has served 3 queens and buried 2. She's learned that queens are temporary, but the women who serve them get power like churches get gold, slowly, quietly, forever. July 1540. Catherine Howard becomes Henry's fifth wife. She's 19, beautiful, and completely unprepared for the crown Henry places on her head. Catherine needs guidance from experienced ladies-in-waiting, protection from court predators. What she gets is Jane Boleyn. Their first meeting happens in Catherine's new chambers. Cloth of gold drapes cover windows that overlook the Thames. Portraits of Henry's previous wives watch from the walls. "Lady Rochford," Catherine says, curtsying awkwardly, "they say you served Queen Anne." Jane smiles. The same smile she gave Anne in the garden. The same smile she gave George's judges. Catherine relaxes. She knows Jane had been close to her cousin Anne Boleyn. She feels small comfort in Jane's presence, a connection to the family she never truly knew. But Jane feels something colder. She isn't here to protect Catherine. She is here to teach her the dangerous lessons of survival in Henry's court, lessons that will not save them, but destroy them both. Over the next year, Jane becomes Catherine's shadow. She arranges Catherine's hair, selects her dresses, and manages her household accounts. She teaches Catherine how to smile when Henry's breath smells of decay, how to laugh at his jokes, how to pretend his touch brings pleasure instead of disgust. Catherine learns quickly, too quickly. She begins to understand that being a queen is not about being a wife. It is a performance. Every gesture, every word, every smile must be perfect, because mistakes are dangerous. Henry is old, sick, and in pain. He cannot act as a husband should. Sometimes he is absent for days. When he is present, he is angry, irritable, and distant. Catherine is left alone in her chambers, surrounded by silk and gold, with no one to trust. The palace is full of whispers, shadows, and eyes that watch. Jane guides her into more advanced lessons: how to hide letters, how to meet men secretly, how to make young men reveal their loyalties. Catherine believes she is learning to survive. Jane knows she is teaching her destruction. Through years at court, Jane has learned the truth. Queens who die make their servants remembered and valuable to the next queen. Queens who live make their servants forgettable. Jane does not act out of jealousy. She destroys Catherine because it is part of her own strategy, a way to survive in a court where power is fleeting and danger is constant.
Spring 1541. Thomas Culpeper approaches Jane after Easter Mass. Young, handsome, and reckless, he reminds her of Catherine longs for in her lonely nights with a sick, aging king. Culpeper suggests the queen might need companionship. Jane studies him carefully. She knows Catherine is innocent in many ways, too young to fully understand the danger. She also knows the court's history, Anne Boleyn, the risks of misplaced trust, the price of desire. Jane sees the choice clearly. She could refuse and risk losing Catherine's favor, or she could arrange meetings between the Queen and Culpeper and risk everything herself. She chooses risk, not for Catherine, not for loyalty, but for power. She directs Culpeper to the Rose Garden after evening prayers, where Catherine walks alone. Jane ensures she is present as the trusted lady, carrying letters, arranging secret moments, and watching every detail. They understand each other perfectly. Summer 1541. Jane orchestrates the most dangerous love affair in English history. She passes letters between Catherine and Culpeper, letters filled with promises, desires, and plans that constitute high treason. She arranges meetings in empty chambers. She stands guard while they whisper, touch, and probably more.
Catherine believes she is careful. Jane lets her believe it. Jane sees what Catherine cannot, the danger, the law, and the king's rootlessness. But she never warned the queen. Catherine trusts her like family. In the same way, once another queen trusted Jane like family. But this time, Jane miscalculates. This time, little did she know, she would be doomed alongside the queen. November 1541. Catherine's past catches up with her present. Henry learns about her previous relationships, her affairs before their marriage. Then, he learns about Culpeper. The investigation moves through the court like plague through a village. Everyone who knew Catherine becomes a suspect. Everyone who served Catherine faces questions. Everyone who helped Catherine faces death. Catherine herself goes to the Tower on November 14th. Jane follows 3 days later. Jane brings her collected evidence to the Tower. Letters in Catherine's handwriting, details of secret meetings, testimony that will save her life and end Catherine's. But Henry doesn't want bargains. He wants blood.
The Tower interrogation room hasn't changed since 1536. Same stone walls, same smell of fear, same portrait of Henry watching from above the fireplace. But this time, Jane isn't just a witness, she's a suspect, and her old strategy won't work. Lady Rochford, the prosecutor begins, Thomas Culpeper has confessed. He says you arranged his meetings with the Queen. Jane's heart sinks. Her old strategy won't work. There's no one left to betray. You carried letters between them, the prosecutor continues, placing evidence on the table. Letters in Catherine's handwriting. Letters Jane delivered herself. You facilitated adultery between the Queen and her lover. Jane tries her usual calculation. She can deny everything, but the evidence is overwhelming. Catherine has already implicated her. Culpeper has already confessed. For the first time in her life, Jane has no testimony to trade, no secrets to sell, no one left to destroy except herself. Yes, she finally says, I helped them. The prosecutors exchange glances. They expected the usual games, denials, bargains, someone else to blame. Instead, Jane gives them the one thing she never gave before, the truth without a weapon attached. December 1441. Something breaks in Jane that survived everything else. Maybe it's returning to the place where her family died. Maybe it's realizing that this time no testimony can save her. Maybe it's understanding that she created a pattern of destruction that finally caught her. Jane starts talking to empty corners. She asks for her dead husband as if he might visit her cell. She relives conversations from years past, arguing with ghosts. Under English law, you cannot execute an insane person. The principle has stood for centuries. Henry doesn't care about principles. In February 1542, Henry will do something unprecedented in English legal history. He'll change the law to kill one woman. Parliament meets in emergency session. The topic? How to execute a mad woman legally. Henry's solution is elegant and terrifying. He doesn't declare Jane sane. He declares sanity irrelevant. The act of attainder passes in 2 weeks. The language targets Jane specifically. No person convicted of high treason shall be exempted from execution by reason of madness or lunacy. They rewrite centuries of legal precedent to kill a widow who knew too much about too many queens. Jane's execution becomes legal on February 11th, 1542. It's scheduled for February 13th, the same day as Catherine Howard's. February 13th, 1542. Dawn breaks cold over Tower Green. Catherine Howard dies first, 19 years old, crying for her mother. She makes the required speech, confessing crimes, praising Henry, and asking for prayers. Jane waits in her cell, listening to the sounds of execution, the crowd's murmur, the axe falling,
the awful silence. At 9 o'clock, her turn comes. Jane walks to the scaffold with steady steps. The same scaffold where Anne Boleyn died. The same block, still wet with morning's blood. She faces the witnesses. These are the moments where condemned nobles traditionally beg forgiveness and proclaim loyalty to the crown. Jane follows the script exactly. "Good Christian people," she says clearly, "I come here to die according to the law. I ask forgiveness for my many sins and pray for the king's welfare." She never confesses to giving false testimony against Anne Boleyn. She never mentions George. She never speaks of the specific crimes for which she dies. Jane gives the crowd exactly what they expect, a conventional confession that reveals nothing. The executioner raises his axe. One stroke, quick and clean. Jane Boleyn dies at 9:15 a.m. on a February morning, 6 years after she watched her sister-in-law die in the same place. Her body rests beside Catherine Howard's in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No monument marks her grave. No inscription records her story. History remembers Jane as a footnote to greater tragedies. The jealous wife who destroyed her own husband, and the sister-in-law who treats her as family. The manipulative servant who corrupted Catherine Howard. But maybe Jane was something more dangerous. Maybe she was England's first serial killer of queens. She just forgot that Henry's appetite for blood was always bigger than hers. Jane Boleyn's death changed English law forever. Future monarchs could execute the mentally ill thanks to Henry's precedent. She died because she turned jealousy into a weapon, because she chose survival over loyalty, because she was smart enough to destroy queens, but not smart enough to stop. In the end, Jane's greatest skill was also her greatest weakness. She knew exactly how to make queens trust her. She just never learned when to stop. Jane Boleyn's execution story reveals the darkest Tudor court intrigue, where survival meant destroying those you served. Her role in Anne Boleyn's execution and downfall changed Henry VIII's reign forever.
Jane Boleyn sent Anne Boleyn to the block, only to follow her 6 years later. But tell me, was Jane a cunning predator who destroyed 2 queens, or just a pawn crushed by Henry's ruthless court? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to History Untold, where the past still whispers.